The story about the U.S. attorneys is summarized in the program. It's a very complicated story in some ways, but it's a pretty straightforward story in others. And what I'd like us to do today is spend some time, and actually I don't think we'll have much trouble, hearing from this distinguished group of people to talk about what we may have learned or should have learned from those events. Inevitably, U.S. attorneys are political creatures. They receive their appointments because of their political connections. They are appointed by a president who is the head of a political party. And there are political aspects to their job. Certainly as a U.S. attorney who might carry out the president's policies concerning law enforcement, that person is participating in the president's political agenda. And so there's good politics, but there's also some bad politics. And I think what we can see and perhaps discuss in the U.S. attorney situation really is about the line between good politics and bad politics. The role that partisanship plays or should play or never play in decisions. The unique kind of legal responsibilities that U.S. attorneys have that make their responsibilities important and in many ways hard to navigate that political line. And I think the bottom line from all the investigations into this incident is that somehow the wrong kind of politics seeped in and caused a great deal of damage to individuals and also damage to the Department of Justice. So that's what we will be doing today. You have in the program short biographies of our speakers today. If you start down at that end, there's Carol Lamb, David Iglesias, Paul Charlton, John McKay, and many of you know Bud Cummins. So this is only a very short biography of these folks, and they really represent an enormous amount of talent, both in their U.S. attorney and public service, but also ongoing. In the audience, we also have another of the U.S. attorneys who was involved in this situation, and that's Dan Bogdan. But as Bud says, he's been recycled. And so he is now serving as a U.S. attorney. Was reappointed or appointed again by President Obama, and so he will not be participating in the panel, but we wanted to recognize his presence here. So, without much more, let me ask the panel, and Bud, I know you don't like me calling you, but I will.
He knows that because he was my professor when I went to law school.
You and I had spent some time talking about good politics and bad politics and the role it plays in the U.S. Attorney's operation. Let's talk about that. What do you mean by good politics and bad politics?
Well, it's just an acknowledgement that a great number of United States attorneys become United States attorneys and get the political appointment through a political process. I'd never prosecuted a case in my life before I became United States attorney, and if you just evaluated people that wanted to be United States attorney on paper, I probably would not have been deemed, at least objectively, to be the most qualified because of experience of prosecuting people. You know, a lot of people know I've been in politics a long time, and I was the counsel for the Bush campaign in 2000. I went and counted Chads in Florida. So, you know, to a great extent, hopefully when my name was submitted, there was also some evaluation of my ability to do the job, but, you know, there was definitely a big political connection to my name being submitted to be United States attorneys. In some of these other cases, it was a little less political. There was more of a committee merit system and evaluation of the candidates, and every state kind of does it differently, how they produce names to submit to the president. But definitely kind of a political process to become a U.S. attorney, and there's a political aspect of the job when you're a United States attorney because there are legitimate, the president, in my view, is entitled to have someone who shares his philosophies about government and his beliefs, so when he establishes the priorities for the department with a finite number of resources and says, these are the categories of activity at the Department of Justice that I think, in my administration, are going to be prioritized. Not that we're going to ignore other things that are going on, but if he establishes a list of priorities, by golly, you better find the resources to get on those cases. And obviously, after 2001, the most obvious example is terrorism. I mean, that was the #1 priority of the Department of Justice. The president established that. And but I think the president's entitled to have someone who shares his general philosophy about guns, about drugs, about whatever is on the agenda at the top of the office and leading that office. There's a whole set there of legitimate politics. What's not legitimate is once you accept the responsibility, you have to leave politics at the door. You can't go decide to target people from the opposing party and look for political corruption only in their quarters. You can't turn down cases when somebody, you know, that I might have worked with in the Republican Party, if their name came up on the radar screen, we certainly had to investigate those cases with as much vigor as we would against a prominent Democrat. So those are the kind of things, obviously, that are improper. And then when this event happened with the United States attorneys, that opened up a whole new series of categories of things that would probably fall into the improper category, and I'm sure we'll cover a lot of that today.
David? Dean, let me just add, and even beyond that, when I interviewed at the Justice Department with former Attorney General Ashcroft, he told me what he told, I believe, all incoming new U.S. attorneys, that is, you've got to leave politics outside. And this was coming from a former senator and governor, somebody who had been a politician. And I took that to heart, and I realized, like Bud, I'd run for office. Like Bud, I'd lost. So I knew the political process, but I knew based on what Ashcroft and his deputy told me that once we took the oath, we had to leave that behind.
Well, look, I was a career prosecutor. I loved prosecuting. I still think to this day the best job I ever will have was being a prosecutor and the United States Attorney. It's a noble profession. And one of the great things about being a prosecutor was that your single and only client was justice, to do what's right. Prosecutors, I think, other than the authority that's given to a soldier in time of war, have more authority than any other public servant. You can, with the issuance of a subpoena, destroy someone's reputation. You can intentionally and methodically seek to take another person's life. So if you politicize that process beyond what Bud just described, that is, when I was an assistant U.S. attorney and Janet Reno was the attorney general and President Clinton was the president, environmental crimes were the big issue. She wanted environmental crimes prosecuted, and we set up an environmental crimes task force. That was fine. That was the president's directive. When Bush came into power, it was guns, and then in 2001, it was terrorism. But it's wrong to say that now that we're in power, we're going to pursue the opposite party with greater vigor. We're going to pursue people who have different political perspectives with greater vigor. That's where the injustice can take place.
Let's talk about the bad politics, maybe. If it's true, then, that this whole thing was about, at some point, bad politics, where did it happen? What were some of the instances in which bad politics interfered, and what could have been done to avoid it?
Well,
John's a professor, so they call on him.
I feel like the dime got dropped. There's so much to abound. I mean, the first point I think is people would say, well, look, all U.S. attorneys serve at the pleasure of the president, and the president can fire you at any time, and that is legally true. And in fact, I think all of us got our phone calls. Most of us on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, we got our phone calls, and it was as much of a surprise to us, believe me, that we would move on. Now, my office had just been formally reviewed, a 4-year review in my case of my office. 30 people interviewed over 120 people, and they made it sound like I was the perfect United States attorney. I thought it was, I didn't think much of the report, to tell you the truth, but I was the most recently reviewed U.S. attorney in the Justice Department. I got the highest marks possible, including a number of best practices, which is what are sort of the ribbon performance of U.S. attorneys, and I got fired a month later. And so, but even with that, I felt the president had the authority to fire me, and I knew of no improper reason, and so I left to teach law at Seattle University, where I currently teach. But it wasn't until, as in most scandals, the cover-up began and false statements were made by the Attorney General. So when you asked where were the bad politics, I think it started with Alberto Gonzales. It continued with the Deputy Attorney General, Paul McNulty. And I think a number of, we've described, they sort of let the kids in charge in the Justice Department for a while. And there were blatantly political people who had been involved in political campaigns who were holding positions of high power in the Justice Department. And they frankly made the decision to fire people like David Iglesias in the middle of a political corruption trial, Carol Lam in the middle of a political corruption trial, and they left open, because of their lies and failures to give any lawful reason for their firings, they left open the question of whether they were being fired to influence criminal investigations. And I think that's what makes a scandal. They covered it up, they lied, they took actions which were improper, and all of them ended up resigning. So I think there's room for analysis here on what actions were improper. The Justice Department has recently determined that they were not illegal, which I think would be another hour or so discussion. But clearly that's the issue. There were a number of people who made terrible decisions. They were, they turned the Justice Department into the laughingstock of the country. Jon Stewart, Jay Leno, every night we had to listen to replays of Alberto Gonzales saying, "I don't remember firing 9 people." Who were all presidential appointees confirmed by the United States Senate. So, we all, and we laughed about that, but most of us who love the Justice Department and what our constitutional obligations were, we winced.
But we've heard this said, that the U.S. attorneys serve the president, and they can be fired for any reason or no reason whatsoever. And in fact, that's repeated in the DOJ investigation report. And so if it's true then that as appointees, U.S. attorneys can be fired for any reason, then wasn't there a reason?
Well, so I think there needs to be, I'm going to combine the answer to your last question and this question, bad politics, good politics, and, if the law says that, we serve at the pleasure of the president and can be fired for any reason or no reason. Now, of course, I think everybody agrees that if it's an illegal reason, that's not allowable. But for example, interfering with the political, or with the intent to interfere with the intent to interfere with an investigation for political reasons purely. If you look back on everything that transpired, I think there have been investigations, and the question was this just sheer incompetence, or was it truly corruption that caused us to be removed from our offices? And when you really take a step back and think about it, is that really where you want your administration, your Justice Department to be on the scale? The needle falls somewhere between incompetence and corruption. I mean, that's not the ideal place for your Justice Department to be. But that's unfortunately, I think, where we sort of ended up. And so we were in the middle. My office had prosecuted Congressman Cunningham, Republican congressman, and we were in the middle of follow-on investigations. The number 3 person at the CIA. We'd done search warrants at the CIA and at his home. We were in the about to announce indictments, and then suddenly the U.S. attorney is removed. It was not a smart thing to do. Let's put it that way. But it's almost the bad politics. I read a short story. It was a science fiction once. It was about how somebody went back in time. They did time travel, and you could go back and see Earth in its prehistoric times, and they had a walkway, and it was very important you not step off the walkway, because if you did, you could change everything. And somebody falls off the walkway and kills a butterfly, and when they go back to the present, everything's just a little bit different because that butterfly got stepped on. Now, that in a way is what happened here, in my view. The Justice Department had reached, and the administration had reached, a very delicate balance and a very delicate understanding of how U.S. attorneys are appointed and how they serve their terms. And I think I think every single one of us and every sitting U.S. attorney, all 93 who served under the president, and all the U.S. attorneys who came before, believed that barring an act of misconduct or true incompetence, they would serve out or be allowed to serve out the president's term or terms. By messing with that formula, they created the sort of question that we were just asked, which is, well, maybe we should go to some sort of different legal system. Maybe we should have only employment or removal for cause or something like that. And there are areas in our political system where you don't want to have to resort to the courts. And there's tradition and there's history about things that you don't want to have to go to the courts for. We saw it in the debate that ensued, the constitutional debate that ensued about executive privilege. You actually had judges, federal judges, saying to the litigants, you don't want to have to drive the courts to make a decision here about the scope of executive privilege. This was when they were trying to get documents from the Bush White House about why people were fired. You don't want to do that. You need to negotiate some sort of settlement. There are areas you don't want to go to. And as I've always said, the problem for me following the removal, as I thought back on it, I'm actually not a member of any political party, not Republican, not Democrat. I'm nonpartisan, which I don't think helped me in this particular scenario. But when the investigation of Duke Cunningham began, I can swear to all of you that it never crossed my mind whether he was a Democrat or a Republican. That's actually how apolitical, and you could say naive, but that's how apolitical I was. Were I U.S. Attorney today and the same investigation arose, I don't think I could swear to you that that thought would not cross my mind. I would hope that it would not change any of my actions, but I could not swear to you that it would not cross my mind. And I think that is what we've lost by what transpired here.
And clearly, the fired U.S. attorneys, we were the most visible of the bad politics at the Justice Department. But if you read the Inspector General's report, which was released in the fall of 2008, it also documents examples of immigration judges being selected on a political basis instead of on a career basis. The civil service laws mandated a nonpartisan basis. Even things as relatively low level as the honors program, that's recent law grads work at Maine Justice are picked by law on a nonpartisan basis. That was also violated. So what happened to us was an example of bad politics, but that was also going on at the Maine Justice Department in Washington, D.C.
Right, and the only thing I'd add is, I'm not here to be a Karl Rove apologist, but there's been a lot of criticism of the White House's involvement, and the legitimate criticism, in my view, is that people lied about the White House's involvement, but there are people that work in every White House who are political people, and they get paid to think up really dumb ideas sometimes. I mean, that's kind of what political consultants do. In my view, the fatal problem that occurred here is, and there's a dynamic between the White House and I think every Department of Justice and the President and every Attorney General, where the President and the White House expect the Department of Justice to get in line like all the other agencies in government and follow the political agenda of the President. And there's often times where Janet Reno, probably every Attorney General going back, has had to tell the President no, because the Constitution gets implicated, or the laws of the United States. And for instance, I would suggest that had the White House staff got all ginned up about problems that they've perceived in New Mexico or in Arkansas or somewhere else, and had called John Ashcroft and said, hey, we want you to fire these 9 guys because they're not helping us out politically out there like they could be, they would have gotten a completely different reception than they got from the Alberto Gonzales team. And so, when the A team was there, it was John Ashcroft as Attorney General, Jim Comey as Deputy Attorney General, David Ayers as Chief of Staff. And there's no question in my mind that they would have fired and walled off the politics and had our backs if we were out doing politically difficult things to do our job correctly. In my view, the real breakdown here was to eliminate that constant friction between the White House and the Attorney General. once the A-team left, they just sent people over from the White House to fill these jobs, so it could just be kind of one seamless process. You know, we have a dumb political idea, let's just let it flow over to the Department of Justice, and there was no grown-up there to say, whoa, up here, that doesn't work. I got the laugh. I stole your line.
You did, that's all right. It's a proper citation. But actually, let's think about that. You mentioned the A-team, if the A-team had been in place, and then presumably the B-team ended up in place.
Or maybe the C team.
Or maybe-
I don't know how far we're down we were at that point.
But one of the things we had been talking about before this was maybe that's a systemic problem. At the end of a president's term, there are people who leave for other ventures, and so inevitably at the end of a president's term, maybe the B team gets put in place. What do you all think of that? Is it a systemic problem where this can recur because you end up with the B team?
You know, the Department of Justice has these convulsions from time to time. And we'll remember Watergate and the Saturday Night Massacre and the lessons that we learned from that. And I hope that we are examining what happened in this instance to see whether or not there can be changes. And we ourselves have had debates, and we don't all agree on what it is that should happen. I was a career prosecutor. I have an idea that perhaps United States attorneys ought not to be politically appointed. We know, for example, that the special agent in charge here in Little Rock, Arkansas, of the FBI is a career guy. Started out as a line special agent, worked his way up to a supervisor and then an assistant special agent in charge, and now he's a special agent in charge. I don't know who he or she is, but that's the process by which he or she gained that position. I happen to think that perhaps we ought to examine whether or not U.S. attorneys ought to go through that same apolitical process where they're selected wholly by merit, and that might be one solution to the problem that was made patent through our firings.
What about on removal? I mean, you've talked about appointment maybe being non-political, but how about removal? Suppose Congress imposes a good cause standard for removal of U.S. attorneys. What do you think of that as a possible way to rein in the bad politics or the B team's antics?
Well, I'd like to just jump in and say real quick, I disagree with Paul, although I know he's a lot smarter than I am. I really believe that the political appointment, if in the right cases, and as I looked up, and there are career prosecutors that became U.S. attorneys on this panel, so I don't want to say anything to step on their toes, but I think that the fact that, you know, somebody like me or there were a lot of other U.S. attorneys that had similar backgrounds to mine, and David would be one of them. I think coming from the outside, having been involved in business, in the legal community, you know, and having that outside perspective helps you come in, because you have to appreciate the discretion the United States Attorney has as they go and make their decisions case by case. Assuming that you're not making improper political decisions, there's still a vast number of decisions, discretion you exercise about whether a person, even though they may have technically violated the law, if that individual case should be pursued or not, or whether it's okay or to let it go, and I think bringing that outside perspective, that career, and also taking into account that the career people in these U.S. attorneys' offices are amazing. They are amazing public servants, but they're career government employees, and I think bringing that outside perspective in often helps enhance the exercise of that discretion. And I personally would hate to see that part of it lost and turned over completely to career government employees.
You know, I find myself in the rare position of actually agreeing with Bud. Only because I actually am a career prosecutor, as were a couple of folks on this panel, and I actually think that the mix is important. It's important to have, I mean, it is a political appointment, and I think that most U.S. attorney communities have both experienced prosecutors in the ranks and also people who got there because they have political connections. And I think that mix, you know, we tolerate the ones who have got there through political connections, and they tolerate us as people who could never do anything but, you know, have a civil service job. But when you get us together, you know, the combination of views is very interesting and very important, and I think it contributes to the overall. It's like having a jury of you know, disparate views, but all legitimate views. And so I think it's a healthy thing to have. What happened here, of course, is the balance got skewed, and many, many bad things happened in the department.
And I would also tell you, you could just look at the Eastern District of Arkansas, going back to Sonny Dillahunty, George Proctor, Chuck Banks, who's sitting right up there, Paula Casey, who may be around somewhere, and I'll exempt myself. I mean, we pretty good group of people, and a lot of professionalism and a lot of good performance by those people. So I before you jumped on an idea to change that system, I think you'd have to look at least it seems to me that it's worked here very well.
So let's think about if there had been a grown-up in charge. At some point, it's somewhere in that chain, what would that grown-up have done?
Well, the first grown-up would have told the truth about what they did, and there were numerous lies told here, beginning with Alberto Gonzales, who I've known since he was on the Supreme Court of Texas, and I do not believe that he has failed to recall being in the meeting that all testify he was in which 9 people's names were put on lists and were fired. He denied that publicly. He then testified in front of the Senate and the House and said, I don't recall, enough times that he's sort of a star on YouTube where his I don't recalls are put to orchestral music. And so beginning with Alberto Gonzales, and I think that there's a combination of both a second term of a president and the fact that, in my belief, the Bush administration, in part because of 9/11 and the wars that were being waged, I think we're looking at lawyers, and I'm sort of speaking to the law students who may be in the room, viewed lawyers and the rule of law as an obstacle to national security. And so in order for them to meet their objectives, they felt that the lawyers needed to be controlled. And I think this is being more and more documented. I'm not a conspiracist, I'm telling you, I think this is true through the Vice President's office, through the White House Counsel's office, and when John Ashcroft, I think, was made to leave as Attorney General, and they sent Alberto Gonzales over, they sent a loyalist over to the Justice Department. Now, that's not the first time that's happened in our history. Bobby Kennedy was John F. Kennedy's Attorney General, but the difference was that when Bobby Kennedy sat in that chair in Main Justice, you had a sense that you had a competent, capable Attorney General of the United States. And I don't think that that's what Alberto Gonzales was. I think he was a loyalist whose job was to make sure the legal opinions came out the way the White House wanted them to come out. And I think in the end, removing 9 United States attorneys who were not seen as loyalists was a major factor in our removals. And that's a pretty, if I'm right about that, even if I may be right about that, that is a pretty dangerous concept, that those who are required to give, for example, legal opinions on the application of the Constitution and the President's war powers would be put into that position because the White House believed their views were the same as the President's. That's a different question than, is it a constitutional exercise of presidential authority? So I think that in the end it came down to individuals viewing independent legal decision makers, which is what U.S. attorneys are supposed to be, applying law to fact so that people don't show up at your house with guns and badges and put you in prison, but based only on evidence. And I think they viewed independent decision makers as ultimately a problem within the Bush administration. I don't think just the first term. I think they got where they wanted to go in the second term.
I think that's right. I think what John says is right, and I want to use that as an opportunity to say something about Bud here in a second. I suspect that somebody in the White House said, rid us of these meddlesome priests, and that's the way the whole thing came out at the end. But I want to talk a little bit about Bud Cummins, because there were very few profiles in courage throughout all of this. Very few people who stood up and said, what's happening here is wrong. But one of them sits here on this panel. It was Bud Cummins. When we were all fired, we decided initially that we would leave quietly because we knew that we were at-will employees and that we would someday have to leave office, and if we had to leave by being fired, that was the way we were going to go. It wasn't until the Deputy Attorney General appeared before the Senate and said these individuals were fired for performance-based reasons, that we knew it was now incumbent upon us to stand up and say it wasn't for performance-based reasons. There was one exception to that the Deputy Attorney General said. There's one individual, however, who has no performance issues, who was replaced wholly for political reasons. This is a good guy, Bud Cummins. Bud Cummins could have put that one in the win column and stepped aside at that point in time. But Bud saw that there was an injustice taking place. He stood up for us, and he stood up for the Department of Justice. He testified before the Senate about what went wrong. He testified before the House about what went wrong, and he didn't have to. He was one of the few voices courageous enough to stand up and defend us publicly, and at no small personal cost to him, because after he stood up and said that what was happening was wrong, the Department of Justice ginned up a whole host of false accusations about Bud's performance as a United States Attorney, and he and his family suffered as a consequence for that. That's an extraordinary kind of courage, and I've never had the opportunity to talk about this publicly, and I thank you, DiPippa, for this privilege to do that. Bud Cummins is one extraordinary gem that's here in Arkansas. I just want to make sure that I have the opportunity to share that thought with all of you.
Are you running for office? You should announce right here, because I think that was good.
No, that's fascinating, Paul. Go ahead.
Well, I'm glad we've established that Bud Cummins is a grown-up.
I didn't go that far. I said Jim.
Well, speaking of grown-ups then, clearly I think Bud did step into that role and did what you would expect somebody with those professional obligations to do. Were there other grown-ups? Were there other people who in this whole sequence may have done the right thing, or at least tried to do the right thing?
The answer's no. I mean, there is. Well, I mean, you just saw it here. We were all looking at each other like, well, what grown-ups?
Well,
I mean, I think. No, I
Comey.
will talk about Jim Comey. Remember, Jim Comey was out of office. I mean, the truth is, they ran John Ashcroft out. Regardless of what you think of John Ashcroft, he was not invited back. Jim Comey, the Deputy Attorney General, enormously powerful individual in the United States government and in the Justice Department. The FBI reports to the Deputy Attorney General. All U.S. attorneys, in a way, report to the Deputy Attorney General. And Jim Comey, although he had left the department, came back to testify and pointed out that any claim that those you see sitting here and several others had performed poorly was false. And he knew, because he was in a way our boss. And that was an important thing to do, because for his replacement, Paul McNulty, to go before the Senate and claim, well, they really were pretty crummy U.S. attorneys, that's why we got rid of them, with no facts to back that up, was a pretty awful thing to have to take. I know in Seattle, for me to be watching Paul McNulty say I was a bad U.S. attorney in the face of the freshest and newest review of an office in the country, and to have Alberto Gonzales go on when he would just say one throwaway line, John McKay was a bad U.S. attorney. That was the front page, top half of the fold headline in the Seattle Times. And we had no defenders. And the person who stepped forward, who had the experience and the knowledge and had been in that position, was Jim Comey. And Jim Comey, in my mind, was a real hero. He didn't have to do that, but he came forward and told the truth. And I think that's really when you saw the lies that were being told by Gonzales and others start to crumble, because they had no basis. It's easy for them to throw us under the bus to save themselves. And I just want to say, and I think it's important for us to add, the fact that I got fired is not a tragedy. I mean, there are many more people who are out of work in this country. It's not the loss of a job. It's not even sort of the trashing of our reputations and attempted by Gonzales and McNulty and others. I'm teaching law. I enjoy it very much. We're all just fine. The problem is what is, I think, laid out well by Carol, which is what they tried to do to the Justice Department, what they tried to inject in terms of politics into the one place we don't want it to be, which is when that police officer or agent comes to your house and arrests you. That's not where we want, in our society, politics to be.
When John says it wasn't the loss of our jobs that we're really here talking about, I mean, that's absolutely true. And we all knew we weren't going to. This isn't a permanent job to begin with, and we all knew that. When I speak about this, I always try to tell people to pay attention to the Inspector General's report about the honors program. For those of you in law school may be familiar with the honors program that I think John mentioned before. Which is a program, the only method by which a new graduate of a law school can enter the Department of Justice without any other work experience. It's a special program run by the Department of Justice to take people in. It became completely politicized under the second half of the Bush administration Justice Department. The Inspector General's report that was done lays out the bare facts. If you were a Republican, clerked for a conservative judge, even if you didn't go to a very good law school, you were in. If you were a Supreme Court clerk, but U.S. Supreme Court clerk, but went to a liberal law school and clerked for a liberal judge, you didn't get into the honors program. It was completely unprecedented at the department. And when it was revealed what had happened after this scandal broke, and then there were more investigations of this kind of conduct at the department, the Department of Justice actually went to the extraordinary measure of sending offers to people who had been wrongly denied a job in the honors department program going back 2 or 3 years. I mean, that's extraordinary, that they would, it's a concession essentially that they were wrongly denied a job. So I think for those of us who had been in the department for 10, 15, 20 years, that's what was so terrible about all of this. It was a loss not only of our jobs, which is a relatively small thing, but a loss of the department that we had worked for decades. And that was, and the department, I mean, what are you going to do? It's the U.S. Department of Justice. It is the United States Department of Justice. It is what distinguishes this country from so many other countries. And to see it completely laid to waste in this manner was very difficult for us.
Before you leave the topic of good guys, the people that come out looking good in this, a couple of people. Senator Mark Pryor knew what had happened in my situation before months before it was public, contacted me, offered to help if I wanted somebody to try to intervene. At that stage, I was in the posture of, well, I serve at the pleasure of the president. He's asked me to leave, I'm going to leave. I don't care for you to intervene, but I appreciate the offer. Very supportive through the whole process. And I will say, most of you know me here know I'm a pretty staunch Republican. There were Democrat senators that took the substance of these issues, as many politicians do, and then went beyond the meaning and tried to make score political points with it. But Mark Pryor knew more about this earlier than any other senator of the United States Senate. He was concerned about it. They were working behind the scenes to try to determine what was going on. They were concerned about the Patriot Act provision that had been slipped in that allowed for an appointment without Senate confirmation. But he didn't grandstand. In my view, he just acted like he'd like a senator and a leader to do. He was working behind the scenes very diligently, and he was also very personally, supportive to me. That guy right there, Vic Snyder, showed up at I can't even tell the story. What was the date of that? March 6th?
March 6th.
That was a really difficult day for all of us. We had to go testify in Congress, and as I'm getting older, I'm getting really emotional about that. Only when I talk about people. I can talk about murder, mayhem, terrorism, you name it, but when I talk about people, I get really emotional. Well, so I'll tell the short version. Vic showed up at the hearing. I don't think he had any reason to be there. I'm sure he had plenty to do on the Hill that day, and he sat with Jody while we testified in the House of Representatives. So there were good guy stories.
Let me follow up with that too, because I don't want to underscore or diminish what it means to be fired on a national scale. It stinks. It's an awful. It's terrible when you're walking through an airport and you see your picture on CNN and it's so surreal. You start to think, look what they're doing to that poor guy, Paul Charlton. It was the most professionally challenging moment in my life. We'll all go through more difficult personal issues in our life, but professionally it was the most challenging event in my life. But at the same time, and on a personal level, and I think what Carol's saying, what Bud is saying, what all of us would say, it was one of the most affirming events in my life. Because at the end of the day, the lesson was what your mother and your father and your grandparents have told you all along: do what's right. And as the investigation finished up and came out, The idea was that we had all done what we believed was right. And people saw that. And as a consequence, I think we've all done well subsequently. And I don't know whether you want to call it karma or biblical or justice, but for the other folks who were involved in our firing, you really can't say the same for them. So it's been a fascinating experience for me, and I think for all of us in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it restored my belief in the American dream, because I'm the son of a Latin American immigrant who came through Ellis Island. And, you know, you hear about the American dream and you see folks who've been able to live that out. And then when it's threatened in the way that it was at the Justice Department, it was really a very difficult moment, which lasted months and years. You know, here we are almost 4 years later, we're still talking about it because, you know, our justice system is the model that the world looks to. And what was it at threat was the fairness of our system, the transparency of our system. And I'm so glad that it righted itself, that those folks that ousted us did have to pay a price, and that those of us that spoke truth to power, a phrase I'd never heard of until just a few years ago, have been restored. So I want to thank you, Dean, for inviting us to let us share this story, because, you know, this is not about us losing our jobs. This is really about one of the premier institutions of our country being threatened and surviving that.
Just staying within the ranks of the Department of Justice in terms of people who did the right thing. I mean, there was Chuck Rosenberg, who was drafted. He was the U.S. Attorney of Eastern District of Virginia and had been Jim Comey's chief of staff when Jim was Deputy Attorney General. And he was, I'll use the word drafted, I don't know if that's the word he would like me to use, but drafted to serve as Alberto Gonzales' chief of staff, which he did for about 6 weeks following the revelation of these firings. But during that time, he tried mightily to set things right, among other things, setting up the internal investigations of what went wrong. And there were people who labored quietly like that, so I don't want, you know, by omitting their names, I don't want it to be thought that there weren't people who tried hard. But I think for a lot of people, those who had not already been pushed out quietly from the department, I think for a lot of people, I know for myself too, there was a certain amount of denial. You know, we saw signs along the way that, I'll confess to that, I saw some signs along the way that things weren't quite right or not as they had been at the department before, but there was a sort of belief that I held, and I think a lot of other people held at the department, that this can't be happening. You know, it's never been, nothing like this has ever happened before. I'm sure I'm just misreading things. And then when it hit, things got so bad so fast that I think it was almost beyond anybody's ability to repair things.
We have some time for questions, and I believe we'll have volunteers with microphones. So if you do have a question, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. We should have 2 of them. Please wait for the microphone before you begin to ask your question. And I have a rule about questions. If it's more than 20 seconds long, it's a comment and not a question. So let's begin right over here. Bob?
Thank you. One of you mentioned Watergate. Can you name a third instance where the Justice Department basic principles have been violated during our history besides Watergate and this instance?
Senator, I'm asking was the Watergate issue. I think, and I'm not going to get this Attorney General or the name of the event correctly, and maybe Dean DiPippa or others can correct me, but there was a time when there were a number of anarchists, and I think before the 1930s, when there were something raids. Palmer raids, thank you, the Palmer raids that took place, named after the Attorney General, and I think people recognize that now as a basic violation of civil rights.
There was a question right over there.
I think, just following up on that last question, I think though, my reading of almost any presidential administration, there's always friction between the White House and the good attorney generals. So, you know, I guess the bad ones, if there's no friction, maybe other bad stuff happened that we never knew about. I mean, you know, the part of the job is to say no. in my opinion, to the White House. And so you're either going to have friction or you're going to have the floodgates open like happened with this crew.
Yes, sir.
One of the things that you hope come out of these post facto analyses is the change for the good. And the word systemic problem was used earlier. Has there been a systemic change for the good in the Department of Justice since your experiences?
We don't know. We got fired.
We'd have to ask Dan Bogdan. He's not talking.
Well, there was one change, which I think was an important one. In the USA Patriot Act, of all great ironies, the USA Patriot Act, there was an amendment during a reauthorization which allowed the president to appoint United States attorneys indefinitely. And United States attorneys, because of the power that they wield, we've discussed previously, are required to be confirmed by the United States Senate. And so under a temporary appointment, it was sort of permanent. I think Tim Griffin was appointed to that position here in Little Rock under those very provisions. And I think that was correctly changed, and I think Senator Feinstein led the way and others to amend the law back to the way that it was before, requiring Senate confirmation or another process for appointing positions in which U.S. attorneys are no longer in their offices. I favor the view that U.S. attorneys should not be removed other than for cause, and I think Paul's suggestion is a good one, which would be a complete change of the system in terms of merit appointment and career U.S. attorneys. I think that's a good suggestion. Another might be that U.S. attorneys, as has been the practice, would not be removed for anything other than for cause. Dereliction of duty, committing a crime in office. I think one U.S. attorney was removed for biting a stripper. Hey, and when I got the phone call, they wanted us, of course, they would give us no information on why we were being removed, and we all asked. And in my head, I said, I don't think I bit a stripper.
Of course, at the end of the day, John was thinking, well, I got fired anyway. I might as well have.
I might as well have been a stripper. So I think actually a for-cause requirement would be a good thing. Although I can tell you also, there was one of our colleagues who wanted to take a certain action, and he called the Justice Department after we'd all been fired, said, well, if I do that, are you all going to fire me? And the response from the official was, I believe at this point you could pee on the leg of the President of the United States and you would not be fired.
And that's an issue, and we had talked about it, and we didn't really get to it today, but it just, as you might imagine, there's these jobs are important jobs with a ton of responsibility, a ton of discretion. There's a tendency on the part of what we call Main Justice in Washington to slowly claw, and not so slowly, claw that discretion away from the United States attorneys and centralize it in Washington, D.C. And there's a certain arrogance that you kind of feel that from the people that get the higher appointments in Washington, D.C., that really they're the only ones that really should be making important decisions on death cases and other, political corruption cases. And so over time, there's a new memo issued every couple of months. And, well, here's another chunk of discretion that we're now taking away from you, and you have to call and ask permission for this. There's actually a whole section in the U.S. Attorney's Manual called prior approvals. All these things, that just lists and lists of pages of things that you can't do without getting permission from somebody in Washington. And I think to some degree what happened here was a little bit of a symptom too of that mentality that really everything important was going to happen in Washington. But if you look at the entire history of the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's offices, you'll see that that's not the case. I mean, Paul Charlton was down there dealing with capital cases on Indian reservations. They're unique. It's nothing we ever deal with here in the Eastern District of Arkansas, and I guarantee you there was probably nobody walking around the halls of Main Justice that really understood the dynamics of those cases. Carol Lamb had San Diego. She had a porous border down there with massive immigration problems. I didn't face that here in the Eastern District of Arkansas either, and so and they probably knew precious little in Main Justice. So hopefully part of the aftermath of this will be to step them back a step and make them respect the authority of these United States attorneys out there, because it's important. We live here. We know what's going on here, and that's why they have us here. And they need to let us do our jobs. And they kind of, over time, and it's not just the Bush administration, it's just kind of another Washington story. They just kind of want to centralize all that authority.
We have time for one more question. Bob?
What are your thoughts and comments about the attorneys that were chosen to replace you?
Well, just a point of clarification, the ones that are presidentially selected and Senate confirmed?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very happy with Ken Gonzales. He was an assistant U.S. attorney. He was a native of New Mexico, understands very difficult Indian country issues, border issues, Army JAG reservist. I mean, you know, I could probably, I can't think of anybody within the office that I would have thought more qualified and more suited for the job. And I've told that to his face. I've told the local media there back in Albuquerque that I thought that was a fabulous choice. So I hope that answers your question.
Let me be clear about what happened here, because there's no doubt in my mind about this. When we were asked to leave, the folks who were behind it had a very, very clear plan in their mind. And it goes back to what John was saying about this amendment they slipped into the Patriot Act. That amendment, they claimed, was put in there giving the Attorney General the right to appoint a replacement U.S. attorney without Senate confirmation to serve until a Senate-confirmed U.S. attorney came in. That power they were putting in there for their own purposes that had nothing to do, in truth, with fighting terrorism, although that's what they said it was for. It was because they wanted to reward friends of theirs or themselves with U.S. attorney positions that would then lead maybe one day to federal judgeships or something like that. It was a nice resume builder. That was their intention. They made it clear to several of us over the phone. It was to avoid having to go through the Senate confirmation process so that they could put in whomever they wanted into those positions. That got reversed when this whole scandal came to light, and that's what John was saying was one of the good results of all of this. Senator Feinstein led the amendment to put it back the way it was, and the president ultimately agreed to that because it was so obvious that had taken place. And in fact, one of the famous emails that came out from one of the fellows back at Justice who was behind all this, he said, well, I think we should just go ahead and do it because if we don't use the power, what good is it having it? So that's clear. So the people who took our places did not get, they failed in that goal of theirs to put very politicized people in. And I think for most of us, you know, pretty good career prosecutors ended up coming in to replace us. And so please keep that, you know, we don't want to be condemning people who took our places because they took our places in the right way. The people who wanted our places did not get into our offices.
As you can see, we've had a lot of very interesting discussions, and at lunch before, as we were sitting around the table, I said, I hope that I can just ask one question and you folks can talk about it the rest of the hour. And you can see that these are people who are not only very committed to the rule of law, but also very thoughtful about its application in the role of the rule of law. If there's anything that comes out of this that we can take away for law students or lawyers or the general public, it's about how delicate the rule of law is. It doesn't operate by itself. It's not a machine that you can turn on and have it work. It requires the good intentions and the good efforts of the people within that system to make the rule of law effective. To the extent then that the folks sitting here today are examples of not only the good politics, but what it means to be devoted to the rule of law, I think we've been very blessed to have them here. So thank you all very much. Welcome.